I came to take my mom's belonging, the little girl said, her voice steady despite the cold. Richard Whitmore stood a few steps in front of her, tall and composed, his presence filling the vast living room like something carved from stone. He studied her carefully before speaking, his tone calm, controlled, and used to being obeyed. "What belonging?" he asked. "And why would you come all the way to my house to demand it from me?" Annie didn't hesitate. "Your wife took it." A faint crease formed between his brows. "My wife?" he repeated. "What exactly are you saying she took?" "My mom's necklace," Annie said. "She sent people to our house. They pushed my mom, called her names, and they took it." Richard exhaled slowly, straightening just a little. "I don't know anything about this necklace," he said, "and I certainly have nothing to do with it. If you have an issue, you should be speaking to my wife." "I tried," Annie said. He paused. "What do you mean you tried?" "I came here before," she said. "Twice. I asked to see her. They told me to leave." Richard's expression tightened slightly. "That doesn't make sense." Before Annie could respond, a calm, measured voice came from behind. "Sir, if I may." Richard turned. The estate's head butler, Mr. Hargrove, stood near the doorway, posture straight, hands folded neatly in front of him. "Yes?" Richard said. "The child is telling the truth, sir," Hargrove said. "She came to the gate 2 days ago, and again yesterday morning. Both times, she requested to see Mrs. Whitmore. Both times, Mrs. Whitmore declined to receive her." Silence stretched across the room. Richard looked back at Annie, something shifting behind his eyes now. "And after being turned away twice," he said slowly, "you decided to come back a third time and demand that I fix it." Annie nodded. "My mom can't come," she said. "She's too sick." Richard held her gaze for a moment, then asked more sharply, "Who is your mother? And what does she have to do with my wife that would make her show up at your house and take anything?" Annie didn't flinch. "My mom's name is Lena Carter," she said. "We live at 214 Maple Street. Apartment 3B. The moment the words left her mouth, something inside Richard shifted violently. It didn't show fully on his face, but his stillness deepened, like a crack had formed beneath the surface. His eyes flickered once, a memory forcing its way back. "Lena." "Say that again," he said quietly. "Lena Carter," Annie repeated. "That's my mom." Richard's jaw tightened. "Your wife came to our house," Annie continued. "She knocked like she had a right to be there. When my mom opened the door, she started yelling, calling her things, saying she should have stayed gone." Richard didn't move. "She said my mom didn't deserve anything from you," Annie added. "Then she told the men with her to take the necklace." A breath caught in Annie's throat before she finished. "They grabbed my mom, and she took it herself." The room fell into a heavy, suffocating silence. Behind them, Hargrove stood perfectly still. Richard's control snapped. "Grace," he suddenly shouted, his voice echoing through the high ceilings like a crack of thunder. "Grace!" Even Annie flinched slightly, not from fear, but from the sheer force of it. Richard turned sharply toward Hargrove, his eyes dark now, no longer calm. "Go get my wife. Now." Hargrove didn't hesitate. "Yes, sir." He moved quickly out of the room. Footsteps echoed in the hallway minutes later, quick, irritated, sharp against the marble floor. Grace Whitmore appeared at the doorway. Elegant, impeccably dressed, composed in the way only someone used to control could be. But the moment her eyes landed on Annie, something flickered. She turned away almost immediately, her voice low and tight as she addressed Richard. "What is this?" she said. "If this is about some nonsense, we can talk later." "I have." "Turn around and look at her," Richard snapped. Grace stopped mid-step. Slowly, she turned back. Richard stepped forward, his voice no longer calm, no longer measured. "No," he said sharply. "We're not talking later. We're talking now." Grace's expression hardened. "Richard, this is hardly the place. Did you go to 214 Maple Street?" he demanded. The question hit her cleanly. For a split second, just a split second, she hesitated. Annie saw it. Richard saw it. Hargrove, standing silently by the door, saw it too. "I asked you something," Richard said, his voice low now, but far more dangerous. "Did you go to that address?" Grace lifted her chin slightly. "And if I did?" Annie's small hands clenched. "She's the one," she said quietly. She came to our house. Grace's gaze snapped to her, cold and sharp. You shouldn't be here. I came for my mom's necklace, Annie said. Grace let out a short, dismissive breath. That woman doesn't deserve anything that came from this house. Richard's expression changed completely. You didn't just steal a necklace, he said slowly. You went there. You humiliated her. And you took it. Grace said nothing. She didn't deny it. And that was answer enough. But instead of backing down, Grace stepped closer, her voice rising with controlled anger. Why are you even entertaining this? She demanded. It's just a necklace, some cheap piece from a woman who should have stayed in the past. Richard didn't respond. Grace's eyes sharpened, searching his face. Why do you care so much? She pressed. Why are you standing here defending her instead of me? You're my husband, she continued, her voice tightening. I am your wife, and yet you're questioning me, in your own house, because of a child and a story you haven't even verified. Richard looked at her then. You're asking the wrong question, he said quietly. Grace's expression flickered. The question isn't why I care, Richard continued. The question is why you thought you could do this. And I wouldn't find out. The room fell silent again. Annie stood perfectly still. The walls Richard Whitmore had built around his past were starting to crack. Where is it? He asked. Grace crossed her arms slightly. Richard, where is it? Grace stood across from him, her posture still elegant, still controlled, but the confidence she had walked in with was no longer untouched. Richard, she said again, softer this time, as if adjusting her approach might restore control. This is unnecessary. You're letting a child manipulate. Where is it? He asked again, cutting through her words without raising his voice. That was what made it worse. Grace's lips pressed into a thin line. She glanced briefly toward Hargrove, then back at Richard, calculating. It's in my dressing room, she said finally. I didn't think it mattered. It mattered enough for you to take it, he replied. She didn't answer that. Richard turned to Hargrove without looking away from her. Bring it. Yes, sir. The butler left immediately, his footsteps quiet but purposeful as they disappeared down the corridor. The moment the door closed behind him, the room shifted again. Grace stepped closer to Richard, lowering her voice so it wouldn't carry, though Annie was still within earshot. You're making a mistake, she said. Whatever you think this is, it's not worth this. Richard didn't respond right away. He was looking at Annie. Did she send you? He asked suddenly. Annie shook her head. No. She doesn't know you're here? She told me not to come, Annie said. But she can't get it back herself. Richard's jaw tightened slightly. Grace let out a quiet, incredulous breath. Of course she didn't send her, she said, a hint of disdain slipping back into her voice. That woman never had the courage to face anything directly. Annie's eyes flicked toward her, but she didn't speak. Richard did. Enough. The word was quiet but final. Richard walked slowly toward the window, his reflection faintly visible in the glass. Outside, the estate grounds were still calm, untouched by what was happening inside. But behind him, nothing felt controlled anymore. He spoke without turning around. You went there yourself? Grace hesitated, then answered. Yes. And you brought men with you? I wasn't going alone, she said defensively. I didn't know what I'd find. You knew exactly what you were looking for. Grace didn't respond. Richard turned back, his gaze sharper now. Did you touch her? Grace's eyes hardened. Don't turn this into something it's not. Did you touch her? He repeated. I took what didn't belong to her, she said. That's all. Annie's hands clenched again at her sides. Richard saw it, and something inside him, something old, something long buried, shifted again. The door opened. Hargrove returned, carrying a small velvet box in his hands. He approached slowly, respectfully, and stopped a few feet from Richard. Sir, Richard took the box. For a moment, he didn't open it. He just held it, as if he already knew what was inside, and wasn't ready to see it again. Then, carefully, he lifted the lid. The necklace lay inside. Richard closed the box. When he looked up again, his expression had changed. He turned toward Annie. This is yours, he said. Annie didn't move. It's my mom's, she corrected. Richard gave a slight nod. Then it belongs with her. He stepped forward and placed the box gently into her hands. She looked down at the box, her fingers tightening around it carefully, like it might disappear if she didn't hold it right. "Thank you," she said quietly. Richard didn't answer. Grace did. "Oh, this is unbelievable," she said, her voice rising again. "You're just going to hand it over? Just like that?" Richard turned to her. "Yes. That necklace came from you," she said. "From this house. From your name. It was never yours," he replied. Her eyes flashed. "I am your wife, and that doesn't give you the right to take what was never yours to begin with." Grace stepped back slightly, as if struck not physically, but in something deeper. "You're choosing her," she said. Richard didn't answer immediately. He looked at Annie again, at the child standing in front of him with nothing but courage and truth. Then he said, "I'm choosing what's right. If this moment touched your heart, please like this video, leave a comment telling us where you are watching from, and subscribe to the channel for more powerful stories of truth, courage, and justice." Grace laughed once, but there was no humor in it. "You don't even know what that means anymore." Richard's voice dropped slightly. "I know enough." Annie shifted slightly, holding the box close to her chest now. "I should go," she said. Richard looked at her. "You didn't come here alone," he said. "I did," Annie replied. He studied her for a moment, then shook his head slightly. "No," he said. "Not this time." She frowned slightly. "What do you mean?" "I'm taking you back," he said. Grace let out a sharp breath. "Richard." "No." Just one word. But it stopped her. He turned to Hargrove. "Have the car ready." "Yes, sir." As Hargrove left again, Richard reached for his coat, his movements precise but carrying a weight they hadn't before. Annie watched him, uncertain now, not afraid, but unsure of what came next. "Will you really come?" she asked. Richard paused for a fraction of a second. Then quietly, "Yes." The drive to Maple Street took a little less than 40 minutes, though to Richard it felt longer. Annie sat in the back seat of the Blacktown car with the velvet box resting in both hands, as careful with it as if it held glass instead of memory. She had stopped speaking a few minutes after they left the estate, not because she was afraid, Richard realized, but because she was tired in the deep, bone-heavy way children only became when they had spent too long being brave. Outside the window, Connecticut's polished roads gave way to older streets. Narrower lanes, rusted fences, aging storefronts, and apartment buildings that had surrendered long ago to wear and weather. The world changed mile by mile. Neatly trimmed hedges became chain-link fences. Luxury SUVs became dented sedans. Coffee shops with imported pastries gave way to laundromats and corner stores with faded lottery signs in the windows. Richard noticed Annie watching him once in the rearview mirror. Not with warmth, not yet, just with the clear, measuring look of someone deciding whether a person meant what he said. He understood that look better than most people would have guessed. "You can sleep if you want," he said at last, his voice low enough not to startle her. "I'm not sleepy," Annie replied. It was an obvious lie. Her eyelids had already drooped twice in the last 5 minutes. Richard almost said so, but he let it go. There were some dignities a person, especially a child, deserved to keep. A red light stopped them just 3 blocks from Maple Street. Richard glanced back again. Annie still held the box tightly against her coat. "Does your mother know how sick she is?" he asked. The question came out more quietly than he intended. Annie looked down at the necklace box before answering. "She knows enough." That answer settled somewhere under his ribs. "And you?" he asked. She looked back up. "I know she stopped getting out of bed much. I know she says she's just tired, but tired people don't cry when they think you're asleep." Annie hesitated, then added, "And I know she loved that necklace more than anything she owned." Richard's hands tightened slightly around the steering wheel. Not more than anything, he thought. More than anything left. The light turned green. Neither of them spoke again until he pulled up in front of a narrow brick building with peeling white paint around the windows and a dented mailbox cluster by the front steps. A faded number hung above the entrance. 214. Richard parked at the curb and turned off the engine. "This is it," Annie said. Though he could already tell, the apartment building looked like the kind of place landlords forgot and tenants endured. A cracked concrete walkway led to the front door. One of the porch lights was broken. The railings on the steps were chipped and rusted at the base. Across the street, a woman in a housecoat stood on a stoop with a cigarette in one hand, watching the Blacktown car like it had landed from another planet. Richard stepped out first and came around to Annie's side. She was already halfway out by the time he opened the rear door. "I can walk," she said. He nodded once. "I wasn't going to carry you." That earned him the faintest narrowing of her eyes, almost suspicious, as if she had been preparing to object and now didn't know what to do with the effort. Together they climbed the stairs and entered the building. The hallway smelled faintly of old radiator heat, bleach, and something fried 2 floors down. Apartment 3B was at the far end of the second-floor corridor. Annie stopped outside the door and adjusted her grip on the box. For the first time since she had arrived at the estate, her confidence wavered. Richard saw it. "She may be asleep," she said quietly. It wasn't really information. It was worry given shape. Richard found himself answering more gently than usual. "Then we wake her." Annie looked up at him once, then knocked. No answer. She knocked again, louder this time. "Mama?" "It's me." A beat passed, then the faint sound of movement inside. Slow, dragging. A lock turned, then another. The door opened only a few inches at first. Lena Carter stood on the other side. For a moment, time did something Richard had not believed time could do. It folded. He saw the years all at once, not as an abstract number, but as damage. She was thinner than he remembered, her face drawn with illness and strain, her skin carrying the grayish cast of someone who had been tired too long. But her eyes were the same, softer now, more guarded, lined at the corners by hardship rather than laughter, but unmistakably the same. And when those eyes lifted past Annie to him, she froze. The door opened another inch, then stopped. Annie stepped forward immediately. "Mama, I got it back." Lena didn't seem to hear her at first. Her gaze remained fixed on Richard, her hand still gripping the edge of the door as though it were the only steady thing in the world. Richard had prepared himself for anger, for a slammed door, for tears, accusations, silence, anything. He had not prepared for this stunned, hollow stillness. Annie lifted the velvet box. He made her give it back. That broke the spell. Lena looked down, saw the box, and for the first time her face changed. Not much. Just enough to reveal pain beneath the shock. She opened the door wider, and Annie slipped inside. Richard remained where he was, one hand still at his side, suddenly unsure whether he had any right to cross the threshold. The apartment behind her was small but neat in the deliberate way poverty often was when paired with dignity. A worn sofa sat beneath the window. A crocheted blanket had been folded carefully over one arm. Prescription bottles lined the edge of a narrow kitchen counter. The room held the kind of quiet that came from too much illness and not enough help. "Annie," Lena said at last, her voice rough. "I told you not to go." "I know," Annie replied, "but you were sad." The simplicity of that answer struck all three of them differently. Lena closed her eyes for a second, then opened them again. "You shouldn't have gone alone." "I wasn't alone coming back." Only then did Lena fully seem to register that Richard was still there. She stepped back, one hand instinctively bracing against the doorframe. "What is he doing here?" she asked. Not to Annie. To the room. To herself. Richard finally spoke. "I brought her home." Lena gave a short, disbelieving breath. "That doesn't answer my question." No, he thought. It didn't. Annie, sensing something she couldn't name but clearly felt, moved to her mother's side and held up the box. "Open it." Lena looked down at her daughter, then slowly took the box. Her fingers trembled before they even touched the clasp. When she opened it and saw the necklace inside, her breath caught audibly. For one fragile second, she looked young again, not because illness had vanished, not because the years had been undone, but because grief had stepped aside long enough for memory to walk through. She really took it back. She whispered. "I told you I would," Annie said. Lena shut the box quickly and held it to her chest, as if afraid someone might still snatch it away. Her eyes lifted again to Richard, and this time shock had given way to something steadier, something more dangerous. "You shouldn't be here," she said quietly. Richard accepted that. "Probably not." Annie looked between them. "Mama, go wash your hands, baby," Lena said, still looking at Richard. and put some water on your face." Annie didn't move at first, but, "Please," that word did it. Annie nodded and took herself toward the tiny bathroom off the hall, though not before giving Richard one last watchful look. As soon as she was out of sight, the apartment seemed to contract. Lena did not invite him in. He stepped inside anyway, but only one pace, careful not to turn the gesture into an invasion. "I didn't know," he said. Lena's laugh was soft and humorless. "That seems to be the story of your life, Richard." Hearing his name in her voice after all these years did something to him he could not afford to show. "When she said your name, you were shocked?" Lena asked. "Good. So was I. When your wife showed up at my door acting like I had stolen something from her." Richard lowered his eyes briefly. He had no defense for that. "She came here herself?" he asked, though Annie had already told him. Lena's hand tightened around the box, in a cream-colored coat and a perfume that hit the room before she did. She looked around this apartment like dirt might get on her shoes. The bitterness in her voice was quiet, and therefore worse. "She said I had held on to something that belonged to my past. Then she said women like me should know when to let go." Richard felt heat rise behind his ribs. Shame first, then anger. "And then?" he asked. Lena met his gaze. "Then she insulted me in my own home and took the only thing I had left that reminded me I wasn't crazy for believing once that someone loved me." The words landed cleanly. No room to dodge them, no room to explain yet. Richard stood in the middle of that small apartment, surrounded by the life he had never come looking for, and understood something with sudden, punishing clarity. The damage was no longer behind him. It was here, breathing, looking back at him through the eyes of a woman he had loved and a child who carried his past in her face. From the hallway, Annie's small voice drifted out. "Mama, do we have any more of the lemon soap?" Lena answered without looking away from him. "Under the sink, baby." Then silence returned. Richard's voice, when he finally found it, was low and stripped of polish. "Lena, we need to talk." She looked at him for a long moment, the necklace still pressed against her heart. Then she said, "After what your wife did, talking is the least of what we need." Richard did not sit down, though the apartment offered him exactly two places to do it: a narrow dining chair beside the kitchenette and the worn sofa beneath the window. He remained standing as if he understood, at least instinctively, that comfort was something he had not earned here. Lena still held the velvet box against her chest. She had not opened it again. She did not need to. The necklace inside was real whether she looked at it or not. Its weight, after all these years, had never truly been in gold or stone. It had lived in memory, in abandonment, in silence. And now, somehow, in the middle of a gray morning in a cramped apartment on Maple Street, that silence had finally come due. From the hallway came the sound of running water and the cabinet under the sink opening and closing. Annie was still in the bathroom, still following her mother's instruction with the unquestioning obedience children gave only when they sensed something serious but could not yet name it. Richard looked toward the sound briefly, then back at Lena. "I deserve that," he said quietly. "All of it." Lena gave him a tired, unreadable look. "That's the easy part." He didn't argue. She moved past him carefully, one hand brushing the wall for balance, and set the velvet box on the kitchen counter beside a pill organizer and a half-empty glass of water. Up close, he could see what Annie must have lived with every day. Unopened mail tucked beneath a bowl of apples that had gone soft, a blood pressure cuff folded beside the sink, a handwritten note from a pharmacy held down by a chipped salt shaker. There were signs everywhere of a person trying to keep control of a life that illness had begun to take apart one piece at a time. "I'm making tea," Lena said, not because she wanted to play hostess, but because it gave her something to do with her hands. "Unless men like you don't drink tea unless it comes with a silver tray." The remark should have sounded sharp. Instead, it sounded exhausted. Richard answered it exactly that way. "I'll drink whatever you have." She reached for the kettle. Her fingers trembled slightly as she filled it at the sink. Richard noticed before she could hide it. "You should sit," he said. Her head turned quickly. "Don't." He stopped. "Don't come in here and tell me what I should do," she said. "Not after all this time." He let the words land where they needed to. "You're right." The kettle clicked against the metal sink when she set it down too hard. The sound was small, but in that apartment it seemed to ring. "I used to imagine this," Lena said, still facing away from him. "You showing up one day. Not like this, maybe. Not older. Colder. dressed like a man who has forgotten what ordinary life looks like. But I imagined you at the door." Richard said nothing. "For a while I thought maybe there'd been a mistake," she continued. "I thought maybe your family had gotten to you. Or maybe you were sick. Maybe you were hurt. I came up with every excuse a woman can come up with when she still wants to believe the best about somebody." She turned then, her expression calm in a way that made the pain underneath it more visible. "But after a few months, I stopped making excuses. Then I had a baby to feed, rent to pay, and no room left in my life for fantasies." The words were not dramatic. That was what made them devastating. Richard's throat tightened. "Lena, no." She lifted a hand, not in anger but in warning. "If you're going to talk, then talk plain. No polished apologies. No careful sentences that sound good in a boardroom. I'm too tired for that." He nodded once. "Then plain," he said. He looked around the apartment one more time, not to judge it, but to understand what his absence had cost. Then he met her eyes. "I never chose to leave you." Lena's face did not change. "That would matter more if you hadn't done exactly that." He accepted that too. "I was told you were gone," he said. "My father came to me 3 days before the wedding. He told me you had left the city, that you didn't want to see me, that whatever we were, it was over." Lena stared at him for a long moment. "And you believed him?" Richard gave a bitter breath that might have been a laugh in another life. "At 23, with a family already arranging the rest of my future and a scandal breathing down my neck? Yes, I believed enough to be broken by it." Her eyes sharpened. Scandal. Now it was his turn to feel the years press down all at once. He moved to the edge of the dining table but did not sit. "Grace got pregnant," he said, "or said she was. By the time I understood how neatly everything had been arranged, my mother was already ill, my father was threatening to cut me off from her care, and every newspaper in Hartford seemed to know pieces of my life before I did." He paused, looking down briefly. "I should have come for you anyway." Lena's gaze did not soften, but it changed, just slightly. Shock, perhaps, or the slow recognition that old wounds had more than one edge. "You're saying she trapped you. I'm saying I was a coward." That, finally, made her look at him differently. People like Richard Whitmore were not supposed to say things like that. Men with money, power, polished reputations, they made explanations, not confessions. "I waited for you," Lena said after a long pause. "For weeks. I had that necklace and a baby growing inside me. And your name in my head, every time someone knocked on the door." Her voice thinned, but she held it steady. "When it became obvious you were not coming, I left before your family could finish what they started." Richard looked at her sharply. "What did they do?" She almost smiled, but there was no warmth in it. What rich families always do when they want a problem gone. "They made it clear I wasn't welcome. Your father sent a woman from his office to explain that if I valued my dignity, I would disappear quietly. There was money on the table. I pushed it back." Shame moved through Richard so fast it felt like heat. "I didn't know." "No," Lena said. "You didn't." The kettle began to hum behind her, a thin rising sound that filled the pause neither of them knew how to cross. From the bathroom, Annie emerged with damp hands and a clean face. She stopped the moment she sensed the heaviness in the room. Her eyes moved from her mother to Richard and back again. "Is everything okay?" she asked. No one answered right away. Lena turned back to the stove and switched off the kettle. "Everything's fine, baby." Annie was old enough to know when adults lied. She walked over to the counter and touched the velvet box lightly with one finger. "Can I see it again?" Lena swallowed and nodded. "Go ahead." Annie opened the box more carefully this time. The necklace caught the light from the kitchen window and answered it softly. Not flashy, not loud, just beautiful, in a way that belonged to another time. "My mama used to wear this on Sundays," Annie said, looking at Richard as if he should know that. "Sometimes on Christmas too." Richard could not speak for a moment. "I remember," he said at last, barely above a whisper. Both Lena and Annie looked at him. The admission changed the air. Annie frowned slightly. "How do you remember?" The question arrived gently, innocently. But there it was. Lena closed her eyes for a second. Richard stood very still, because this was the moment they had both been circling since he stepped through the door. The moment when truth would stop being abstract and enter the room fully. Richard looked at Annie, not at the necklace, not at Lena, but at the child whose face carried pieces of the past he had refused to examine too closely when he first saw her. Because, he said slowly, there was a time when your mother meant more to me than anything. Annie looked down at the necklace, then back at him. More than your wife? Richard did not hesitate. Yes. Lena drew in a quiet breath, as if the honesty hurt more than a lie would have. Annie processed that with the serious attention only children gave questions they considered important. Then why didn't you come? The apartment went still. There it was. The clean blade of childhood. No euphemism, no mercy. Just the question adults spent entire lives trying to walk around. Richard forced himself not to look away. Because I failed, he said. Annie absorbed that too. Did you know about me? No. That answer came faster, sharper. It hurt all three of them in different ways. Lena set down the teacups harder than she meant to. I didn't tell you, she said, not looking at either of them. By the time Annie was born, the papers were full of your wedding. Your father had made himself clear. And I had no intention of letting my child grow up begging at gates that would never open. Richard closed his eyes briefly. She had no idea how close those words struck to bone. Annie touched the necklace again. But I went to the gate, she said softly. Lena looked at her daughter, and everything hard in her expression gave way for just a second. I know, baby. And it opened. No one spoke after that, because the truth in those 3 words was too large for the room. Richard felt it more than heard it. The gate opened, a small thing on its face. Security code, metal hinges, a decision made in seconds, but beneath it lay something else, something he had not wanted to name even to himself. A second chance. He opened his eyes and looked at Lena. She looked tired, guarded, ill, and more beautiful in her honesty than anyone in his world had been in years. The damage between them was real. Vast. Not something a ride home and a returned necklace could erase. Still, something had shifted. He heard himself say it before the polished, careful part of him could intervene. Come back with me. Lena stared at him. What? The estate has a medical wing, private care, nurses, specialists if you need them. Annie shouldn't be carrying this by herself. Her expression hardened immediately. I am not going back to that house. Not for me, he said. For her. For both of you. Annie looked from one to the other, the necklace still in her hands, the question of her whole life hovering unspoken in the room. Lena's answer did not come quickly. She looked at the box, at her daughter, then at the man who had once broken her without fully knowing how. When she finally spoke, her voice was calm again, but no longer closed. You don't get to decide that today, she said. Richard nodded. Fair enough, he thought, because for once in his life, the next step would not belong to power, money, or pride. It would belong to the people he had failed. And somewhere deep beneath the guilt, beneath the shock, beneath the years already lost, one truth had become impossible to ignore. He had not just found Lena again. He had found the child who should have changed everything. Richard left the apartment just before noon, but he did not leave unchanged. The door to 3B closed behind him with a soft click, and for a moment he remained in the hallway, one hand in his coat pocket, the other hanging uselessly at his side. The building was quiet in the way old apartment houses often were, full of distant televisions, muffled footsteps, and pipes that complained behind the walls. Yet none of that reached him clearly. His mind was still inside that small kitchen, still fixed on a velvet box, a trembling hand, and a little girl who had asked the kind of question that did not stop echoing simply because the conversation had ended. Why didn't you come? He walked back down the stairs more slowly than he had climbed them. Outside, the day had warmed slightly, but the city still looked tired. A gust of wind carried the smell of fried food from a diner half a block away, mixed with traffic exhaust and damp concrete. Across the street, the woman in the housecoat was still on her stoop, though now she held a grocery bag instead of a cigarette. She watched him with the open suspicion working-class neighborhoods reserved for expensive cars and men in tailored coats. Richard did not blame her. He got into the car and sat there without starting the engine. The polished leather, the quiet interior, the faint scent of cedar and expensive soap. None of it felt like his life at that moment. Not after Lena's apartment. Not after the sight of prescription bottles lined up like soldiers trying to hold a failing body together. Not after Annie, standing with that necklace in her hands as if she understood, somehow, that she was holding proof that the world had once been kinder than it became. He let out a long breath and finally started the car. The drive back to the estate felt even longer than the drive into town. His phone vibrated twice on the console before he picked it up. The first call was from his office. The second was from Grace. He ignored both. Then a third came in, this one from Martin Keene, his family attorney. Richard stared at the name until it stopped ringing. So Grace had already begun. Of course she had. He merged onto the interstate with steady hands and a mind that was anything but steady. For years, he had lived inside structures built by other people, his father's expectations, his family's reputation, his marriage's arrangement, his company's image. He had mistaken endurance for discipline, silence for strength, duty for decency. But today, for the first time and longer than he cared to admit, he saw those things for what they had often been, excuses. By the time the Whitmore estate came into view, its stone facade looked less like home than headquarters. The gates opened at his approach. He drove through them and parked near the front steps just as Hargrove emerged from the main doors. The old butler descended carefully, his expression composed but more attentive than usual. "Welcome back, sir." Richard stepped out and handed him the keys. "Is she still here?" Hargrove did not need to ask who. "Mrs. Whitmore is in the blue sitting room. She has asked 3 times when you would return." Richard gave a short nod. "And my attorney? Mr. Keene arrived 20 minutes ago. He is waiting in the library." Richard looked toward the windows of the west wing, where the blue sitting room overlooked the south lawn. "Tell Mr. Keene I'll see him in 15 minutes. "Yes, sir." Richard started toward the house, then stopped. "Hargrove." "Yes, sir." "I want a physician sent to 214 Maple Street, quietly. The best one we can get on short notice. I don't want anyone from my mother's old circles hearing about it, and I don't want the bill going through the usual channels." Hargrove absorbed that without surprise. If he was startled, decades of service had taught him not to show it. "For Miss Carter?" Richard met his eyes. "For Lena." A small pause followed. Not judgment, just recognition. "I'll arrange it immediately," Hargrove said. Richard entered the house without removing his coat. The blue sitting room lived up to its name in every possible way. Pale silk walls, blue velvet chairs, a marble fireplace, silver-framed photographs, arranged with calculated elegance. Grace stood near the mantel with a crystal glass in one hand, dressed now in cream rather than the darker suit she had worn earlier, as if a change of clothes might also change the direction of the day. She did not greet him as a wife greets a husband. She greeted him as a combatant receives a rival. "You went to see her," she said. Richard closed the door behind him. "Yes." Grace laughed once, sharply. "Of course you did." He said nothing. She took a sip from her glass, though her hand was not as steady as she wanted it to appear. "Do you know how humiliating today has been? Your staff saw you hand over that necklace, as if I were the one who had done something shameful." Richard looked at her for a long moment. "You were." Grace's jaw tightened. "That woman had no right to keep something that came from you. That woman has a name." "Oh, don't do that," Grace snapped. "Don't suddenly discover a conscience because a child turned up at the gate with big eyes and a dramatic story." Richard walked farther into the room, slow and controlled. It wasn't a story. Grace set her glass down too hard on the mantel. "You don't know what she told me when I went there." He stopped. "Then tell me." Grace stared at him, and for the first time that day her anger revealed what it had been protecting all along. Fear. "She looked at me like I was the intruder," Grace said. "In that dingy little apartment, with those pills on the counter and that old blanket on the sofa, she still looked at me like I was the outsider, as if I was the one trespassing on a life that should have been mine." Richard's face remained still, but his voice cooled. "You were." Grace flinched. Then she drew herself up straighter. "Do you have any idea what it is like to live with a ghost?" she asked. "To watch your husband disappear into himself every time he opens a drawer and stares at something he never explains? To know that some part of him never belonged in this house? Never belonged with me?" The question did not move him as she hoped it might. Instead, it clarified something. "You knew," he said. Grace's eyes narrowed. "Knew what?" "You knew who the necklace belonged to before you went there." Silence. Then she looked away. That was answer enough. Richard's voice lowered. How long? Grace did not speak. How long have you known? Her lips parted, then pressed closed again before she answered. A few months. And instead of asking me, you sent people to harass a sick woman in her home. Grace turned back sharply. Because I was tired of being second to someone who was supposed to be gone. Richard felt something settle into place inside him. Not rage. Rage would have been easier. This was worse. This was certainty. You should have asked me, he said. She let out a bitter breath. And what would you have said? That you loved her? That you still think about her? That every year of this marriage was built on a lie too old and too expensive to correct? Richard did not answer, because the answer, at least to part of that, was yes. Grace saw it in his silence. For a moment, all the polish left her face. She looked older, not by years, but by truth. So that's it, she said softly. One child shows up, and suddenly I'm the villain. You made yourself the villain, Richard replied. The room went still. Grace took a step toward him. I am your wife. He met her gaze without softness. That title does not excuse cruelty. Something flashed across her face, wounded pride first, then anger fierce enough to scorch everything around it. Cruelty? She said. Do you want to talk to me about cruelty? Fine. Let's talk. You married me because you were cornered. You stayed because it was convenient. You gave me your name, your house, your public loyalty, and nothing else. I have spent 17 years eating dinner across from a man who looked at me as if I were a sentence he was serving. Richard had no defense against that because it was true in ways he had been too cowardly to name. But truth was not the same as innocence. You had every right to resent me, he said. You had no right to take that out on her. Grace laughed again. But this time her voice broke at the edges. Her. Always her. Even now. He did not raise his voice when he answered. This is over, Grace. Her face went completely still. Perhaps she had expected fury, a threat, another cold withdrawal. Not this. Not the quiet finality of a man who had, at last, made a decision. What exactly is over? She asked, though her expression said she understood. Richard held her gaze. This marriage. The words entered the room and stayed there. Grace stared at him as if waiting for him to take them back. He did not. From the hallway came the faint ticking of the grandfather clock outside the library. Somewhere downstairs, a maid's cart rolled over tile. The world, indifferent and orderly, continued. Grace drew in a sharp breath. Because of her? No, Richard said. Because of what you did. Because of what I allowed. Because if this house stands for anything, it cannot stand for that. The old Whitmore part of him almost recoiled at his own words. Men in his family did not tear open respectable lies. They preserved them, polished them, passed them down, but something in him had already crossed that line on Maple Street. Grace's eyes filled, though whether with tears or fury, he could not tell. You will regret this. Maybe, he said, but not as much as I'll regret saying nothing. He opened the door. Hargrove will see that you have whatever you need for the next few days. After that, Martin Keene will handle the rest. Grace did not move. She stood beside the mantel like a portrait of wounded privilege, beautiful and furious, and suddenly unable to command the room by standing in it. As Richard stepped into the hallway, her voice stopped him. Was the child worth it? He turned back just enough to answer. It isn't about worth, he said. It's about what should never have happened to begin with. Then he closed the door behind him and walked toward the library, where his attorney waited. But before he reached it, he stopped at the long window overlooking the drive. Beyond the iron gates, beyond the trimmed lawns and old money stone, there was a little girl in a second-floor apartment clutching her mother's necklace, like a promise dragged back from the dead. And for the first time in years, Richard Whitmore understood that justice did not always arrive in a courtroom or a boardroom. Sometimes it came in small shoes, with tired eyes and a voice too brave for 6 years old. Sometimes it came and stood at your gate until you were finally ashamed enough to open it. Martin Keene had been Richard Whitmore's attorney for 12 years, which in Whitmore terms meant he had spent more than a decade cleaning up expensive decisions made by powerful people who preferred the appearance of order to the burden of truth. He was waiting in the library when Richard entered. standing beside the fireplace with a leather folder tucked under one arm and the expression of a man who already suspected the meeting would not go as he had planned. The library was one of the oldest rooms in the house. Dark walnut shelves rose to the ceiling, lined with leather-bound volumes no one had opened in years. The air carried the familiar scent of paper, cedar polish, and old money. Normally, the room calmed Richard. Today it felt like a courtroom. Martin turned as the door closed. "Richard, I want the divorce papers prepared today," Richard said. No greeting, no preamble. Martin, to his credit, did not immediately react. He only set the folder down on the table beside him and asked, "Is this a serious instruction or an angry one?" Richard removed his coat and laid it over the back of a chair, then remained standing. "Both." Martin studied him carefully. "Grace called me an hour ago. She said there had been an incident." "There was. She also suggested that once you'd had time to cool off, we would all realize this was a domestic dispute better handled privately." Richard gave a short, humorless breath. That's one way to describe a woman sending men to intimidate a sick mother and steal from her. That made Martin still. "Grace did what?" Richard walked to the decanter at the sideboard, poured himself 2 fingers of bourbon, and did not drink it. He only held the glass in one hand, watching the amber liquid settle. "You heard me." Martin was silent for a beat, then another. "Is there proof?" "There's enough for me." "In court, that may not." "I said there's enough for me." Martin accepted the correction with a small nod. He knew Richard well enough to hear what mattered. This was not a negotiation. "Not today." "Then I'll begin the paperwork," he said. "But if this moves forward publicly, there will be fallout. The board will have questions. So will the trustees, the hospital foundation, the press. Let them ask." Martin blinked once. "That's not usually your position." "No," Richard said quietly. "It isn't." He finally took a sip of the bourbon. It burned less than he needed it to. Martin opened the folder and glanced down at the notes he'd prepared before Richard arrived, most of which were now useless. "If there's another party involved," he said carefully, "someone from your past, perhaps, we need to discuss whether she is likely to be brought into this." "She will be," Richard said. "And I won't let her be dragged through mud to protect anyone in this house." Martin looked up. "Who is she?" Richard did not answer immediately. He set the glass down and stared at the fire instead, though the fire itself was only decorative, lit by gas and controlled with a switch hidden in the wall paneling. A civilized flame, a curated warmth. "Her name is Lena Carter," he said at last. Martin's expression changed slightly. He knew the name, or thought he did. "Lena Carter," he repeated. "From before Grace?" "Yes." Martin closed the folder. This was no longer legal housekeeping, it was history. "And the child?" he asked. Richard's throat tightened almost imperceptibly. "Her daughter." Martin waited. Richard did not elaborate. The silence did the work for him. Understanding came slowly to the attorney's face, followed by the precise kind of concern that belonged to men who spent their lives anticipating consequences. "Richard, I know. That changes things. It changes everything." Martin leaned back slightly, processing. "Does the child know?" "No." "Does Lena?" Richard did not respond. That, too, was an answer. Martin removed his glasses and polished them with the edge of his handkerchief, buying himself a moment. "Then, before anything else happens, you need to decide what your responsibility is going to look like." The phrase irritated Richard more than it should have. It sounded too clean, too administrative, for what he had seen that morning. Responsibility. As if a word broad enough could make up for lost years, missed birthdays, unanswered questions, a child growing up without even the right absence to resent. "I've already started," he said. Martin put his glasses back on. "Meaning?" "I sent a physician to her apartment." That earned a small nod. "Good." Richard looked at him sharply. "Good?" "Yes," Martin said. "Because if you're asking me as your attorney, then discretion matters. But if you're asking me as a man who has watched you move through your own life like a guest in it for more than a decade," he hesitated, then finished plainly. "Good. It's about time." Richard said nothing. Martin had been with him through board fights, hostile acquisitions, one Senate inquiry, and the slow death of Richard's mother. They were not friends, not exactly, but there were moments when professional loyalty took on the shape of something close to it. A knock came at the library door. Richard turned. "Yes?" Hargrove entered. his posture as precise as ever. "Sir, Dr. Miriam Ellis has agreed to visit Miss Carter this afternoon. She is leaving the clinic within the hour." Relief did not show on Richard's face, but it moved through him anyway. "Thank you. There is one other matter," Hargrove said. Miss Carter's daughter called. Richard's attention sharpened instantly. "Annie?" "Yes, sir. She asked if you would be returning the box." "The box?" "The velvet one, sir. She says her mother put the necklace away, but she would like to keep the box because it makes the necklace feel safe." The room went very still. Martin glanced down discreetly, perhaps understanding that he had just become witness to something far more intimate than legal strategy. Richard swallowed once. "Tell her she can keep it." Hargrove inclined his head. "I already did, sir." That almost drew a smile from Richard. "Almost. And sir," Hargrove added, "she asked me to tell you that her mother fell asleep on the sofa, and that she put a blanket over her." The image rose in Richard's mind with painful clarity. The small apartment, the worn sofa, Annie's careful little hands trying to do what adults should have done for them long ago. "Thank you, Hargrove," he said quietly. When the butler left, Martin waited before speaking. "You're in deeper than paperwork now." Richard looked toward the closed door. "I know." "No," Martin said. "I don't think you do." That drew Richard back. "Then enlighten me." Martin folded his hands. "A divorce is a matter of property, public image, and legal consequence. A child is none of those things. She will not care what the papers say or what the board thinks. She will care whether you show up, whether you tell the truth, whether, after walking into her life like this, you stay." He paused. "That is a far more difficult contract to honor." The words landed because they were true. Richard thought of Annie standing at the gate, not crying, not pleading, simply refusing to leave. He thought of her in the car, too tired to admit she was tired. He thought of her asking with unfiltered seriousness, "Did you know about me?" "No." That answer would haunt him for the rest of his life. "What do I do?" he asked, and the question left his mouth before pride could stop it. Martin regarded him with open surprise. In 12 years, Richard Whitmore had asked many questions. None of them had sounded like this. "You start by going back," Martin said. "Not with money, not with solutions, with honesty. Then you listen more than you defend yourself. You let Lena be angry. You let the child be confused, and you don't decide for them what forgiveness is supposed to look like." Richard absorbed that in silence. It sounded simple when spoken aloud. It would be anything but. Martin stood and gathered the folder. "I'll prepare the divorce filing and have a preliminary draft by evening." "But Richard," he waited until Richard met his eyes. "If there is any chance that child is yours, do not let your family's habits decide what kind of man you become next." After Martin left, Richard remained alone in the library for several minutes. The bourbon sat untouched now on the side table. Outside, the late afternoon light had shifted, turning the lawn gold in places and shadowed in others. Somewhere deeper in the house, he could hear doors opening and closing, staff moving carefully around a problem they knew better than to discuss. He walked to the window and stood there with one hand in his pocket. His father had built this estate on certainty, on bloodlines, leverage, appearances, alliances. Men like Edmund Whitmore believed the world could be arranged into permanence if one had enough money and enough nerve. Richard had spent half his life inheriting that machinery, and the other half pretending it did not own him. But Maple Street had exposed something brutal and plain. While he had been preserving the architecture of his life, other people had been surviving the wreckage of it. His phone vibrated again. This time it was an unfamiliar number. He answered immediately. "Richard Whitmore." There was a pause. Then Annie's voice, smaller over the line than in person, but just as steady. "Mr. Whitmore?" Something in his chest tightened. "Yes. I'm sorry," she said. "Mr. Hargrove said not to call too much. But Dr. Ellis is here now. And Mama looks scared. She doesn't like doctors much anymore." Richard turned from the window. "Is she letting the doctor in?" "Yes, sir, but she's pretending she's not worried. Despite everything, that almost made him smile. Your mother was always bad at pretending." A quiet pause followed. "You said always," Annie replied. He closed his eyes for a second. "I did." Another pause. Then softer. "Are you coming back?" He looked out at the long driveway, the iron gates in the distance, the the entire history of his mistakes standing silently behind them. "Yes," he said, "I'm coming back." And as soon as he said it, he knew this time the promise would cost him something real. Good, he thought. It should. By the time Richard left the estate for Maple Street again, the light had begun to soften into late afternoon, the kind of pale gold that made even tired neighborhoods look briefly gentler than they were. He drove himself this time. No town car, no driver, no buffer between his choices and their consequences. The call with Annie stayed with him the whole way. Mama looked scared. The words had struck him with unusual force because they held no accusation, only observation. Annie was not asking him to save anything. She was simply telling the truth as she saw it, the way children did before the world taught them to decorate reality for the comfort of others. When he reached 214 Maple Street, Dr. Miriam Ellis's sedan was already parked at the curb. Richard recognized her license plate from his mother's final years. Miriam Ellis had been one of the few physicians his mother trusted, partly because she was excellent, and partly because she never treated suffering as an inconvenience. She was in her late 50s now, silver threaded cleanly through her dark hair, with the alert, practical face of a woman who had spent her career telling families hard things in a voice calm enough to make them survivable. He climbed the stairs and knocked on the apartment door. Annie opened it almost immediately. She must have been waiting nearby. For a moment she simply looked up at him, as though confirming that he had, in fact, done what he said he would do. Then she stepped aside without ceremony. Dr. Ellis stood near the kitchen counter, slipping her stethoscope back into her bag. Lena sat at the table, one hand wrapped around a mug she had not touched. Her face had lost some color since Richard last saw her that morning, though perhaps that was less about illness and more about the exhaustion of being examined, questioned, seen too closely after so many years of surviving unseen. Dr. Ellis turned when Richard entered. "Mr. Whitmore." "Doctor." She gave him the brief nod of a professional who knew exactly how much history must be in the room and had no interest in stepping into more of it than necessary. "I've finished the initial assessment." Richard glanced at Lena before asking, "And?" Dr. Ellis closed her bag. "Her condition is serious, but not beyond management, if it's addressed properly. She's been neglecting treatment." "I have not been neglecting it," Lena said, tired but sharp. "I've been spacing it out because medications cost money." Dr. Ellis accepted the correction without defensiveness. "You've been forced to ration care," she said. "That doesn't change the medical reality." She turned back to Richard. "She needs comprehensive testing, consistent medication, and monitoring. Preferably somewhere she can rest without having to climb stairs, manage a household, and pretend she isn't exhausted." Lena's mouth tightened. "I'm still here." "Yes," Dr. Ellis replied mildly, "which is exactly why I'm speaking plainly." Annie stood near the sofa, her gaze moving between them. Richard could see the effort it took for her to remain quiet. She was listening to every word, fitting them into whatever private map children made when adults discussed danger over their heads. "Can she get better?" Annie asked. The question changed the room. Dr. Ellis looked at her with the kind of direct kindness that did not insult children by lying to them. "She can get stronger," she said, "but only if she lets people help her." Annie nodded once, solemnly, as if receiving instructions rather than comfort. Lena stared down into her untouched tea. Richard knew that posture. It was not surrender. It was calculation. Pride trying to negotiate with need. Dr. Ellis rested one hand lightly on the back of a chair. "I'll have my office arrange the blood work and prescriptions," she said, "and I'll come by again tomorrow if necessary, but she should not be left to manage this alone." That last sentence lingered. It was aimed at the room, but its weight landed squarely on Richard. He met the doctor's eyes. "She won't be." Lena looked up at that, quickly and sharply, but Dr. Ellis merely gave a small nod, as though she had heard promises before and would wait to judge this one by its endurance. After she left, the apartment seemed to exhale. The quiet that followed was not peaceful. Exactly. But stripped of interruption. Annie walked to the door, locked it the way children in uncertain neighborhoods learn to do, then came back and climbed onto the sofa without being told. Richard remained standing until Lena spoke. "You arrange doctors fast." He accepted the edge in her voice. "I know people." That was always true. He did not answer immediately. The old accusation beneath the remark was fair. I know people. I have resources. I can open doors. And where exactly had all that power been when she needed him 20 years ago? Annie looked from one adult to the other. Dr. Ellis said Mama shouldn't be alone. Lena turned toward her daughter with practiced gentleness. I'm not alone, baby. Annie's expression didn't change. That's not what she meant. Richard almost smiled, not because anything was funny, but because the child missed nothing. Lena seemed to know it too. She leaned back slightly in her chair, weariness showing now in every line of her body. Annie, sweetheart, could you bring me the blanket from the sofa? Annie picked up the crocheted blanket, but instead of handing it over, she walked behind her mother and draped it around her shoulders. The tenderness of the gesture was so natural, so unperformed, that Richard had to look away for a second. Thank you, Lena said softly. Annie climbed back onto the sofa. So what happens now? No one answered right away. Finally, Richard said, That depends on your mother. Lena gave him a tired look. Don't make me the villain in a choice I never asked to have. I'm not. Then don't stand there acting as if this is simple. It isn't. He moved closer to the table, but carefully, leaving enough space that his presence did not become pressure. I know it isn't. Do you? She asked. Do you really? Her voice stayed low, which made it more cutting, because from where I'm sitting, it looks like you walked into an old wound and decided resources could solve what regret created. The truth of that landed hard. He let it. You're right, he said. Money won't fix this. Annie frowned slightly. Then why do grown-ups always talk like it does? Neither adult had a good answer. Richard finally took the chair opposite Lena, the one he had avoided earlier. The wood creaked beneath his weight. It was a small, ordinary sound, almost absurd in contrast with everything unsaid between them. Because, he said to Annie, sometimes grown-ups confuse what can be paid for with what can be repaired. Annie considered that. That sounds dumb. It startled a laugh out of Lena before she could stop it. The sound was brief, fragile. But it changed the room more than anything else had all day. Richard looked at her instinctively. For just a second, he saw the woman she had been before hurt, and years had worn her down. Lena saw his expression, and the ghost of that laugh vanished. Don't, she said quietly. He understood. Don't look at me like memory is enough. Don't act as if one shared moment can erase what happened. So he lowered his eyes. Fair. Annie tucked one leg under herself on the sofa. Are you going to stay for dinner? Lena and Richard both turned toward her. What? Annie asked. You came back. It was not invitation exactly, more like logic. Lena rubbed one hand over her temple. We don't even have proper groceries. Richard looked toward the kitchen automatically. There was a loaf of bread, a jar of peanut butter, a carton of eggs, some soup cans, and half a gallon of milk that looked close to expiring. The sight of it made something in him harden not at Lena, but at the long chain of failures that had brought things to this. I can get food, he said. Lena let out a tired breath. Richard, it's not a grand gesture. It's dinner. That's exactly how grand gestures begin. He almost said, then let this be a small one, but decided against it. She had earned the right to distrust ease, especially from him. Annie, however, was less interested in adult pride. Can we get chicken? She asked. And mashed potatoes? Mama likes mashed potatoes when she's tired. Lena closed her eyes briefly, as though motherhood sometimes required surviving one's own child's honesty. Baby, Richard stood. Chicken and mashed potatoes, he said. Anything else? Annie looked thoughtful. Sweet tea. That is not dinner, Lena murmured. It helps, Annie replied. Richard found himself asking, do you still like lemon pie? The question escaped before he could stop it. Lena looked up at him slowly. There it was again, that dangerous crossing between then and now. He had not meant to reveal something so specific, so intimate, in front of Annie. But it was too late. How do you know that? Annie asked immediately. Lena and Richard held each other's gaze a moment too long. Then Lena answered, not looking away from him. Because there was a time he knew a lot of things about me. Annie absorbed that in silence. It was not enough of an answer, but it was more than either adult had meant to give. Richard reached for his coat. I'll be back in 30 minutes. You don't have to, Lena said. He nodded once. I know. That was not the point anymore. At the door, Annie spoke again. Mr. Whitmore? He turned. She was holding the velvet box in her lap, stroking the lid with one thumb the way children touched beloved things when they needed reassurance. Thank you for coming back, she said. The words were simple. No ceremony, no forgiveness inside them. Just acknowledgement. And somehow that made them harder to bear. Richard stood there for half a second too long, then answered with the only honesty he had. I should have come a long time ago. Annie looked at him with those solemn, searching eyes. But you're here now. He stepped into the hallway carrying that sentence with him. But you're here now. It was not absolution. He knew better than that. The years behind him remained what they were lost. Damaged. Unreturnable. Still, as he walked down the worn staircase toward the fading light of Maple Street, one truth had begun to settle with painful clarity. Redemption, if it existed at all, would not arrive all at once. It would not come through speeches or checks or legal papers waiting back at the estate. It would come this way, one return at a time. Richard returned with 2 paper bags, a cardboard drink tray, and the uneasy awareness that he had never in his adult life been so nervous about bringing someone dinner. The neighborhood diner on the corner had looked exactly the way places like that always did. Faded menu board, red vinyl booths, coffee that tasted better than it had any right to, and a waitress in her 60s who called every man under 70 honey whether he deserved it or not. When he had asked for fried chicken, mashed potatoes, green beans, sweet tea, and lemon pie, she had studied him over the rim of her glasses and asked, "You feeding a family or apologizing to one?" Richard had nearly answered truthfully. Now, climbing the stairs to apartment 3B with takeout in hand, he realized the absurdity of it all. There were men in Connecticut who waited weeks for an appointment with him. Senators returned his calls within the hour. Financial reporters treated his opinions like weather systems. And yet nothing had unsettled him quite like the idea of knocking on Lena Carter's door a second time in one day and hoping not to be turned away. Annie opened the door before he could knock. "You came back fast," she said. "You timed me?" She shrugged, but there was a small spark in her eyes now, the first hint of childlike mischief he had seen from her. "Maybe." He held up one of the bags slightly. "Then I didn't want to miss my deadline." That earned him something close to approval. Annie stepped aside and he entered. The apartment smelled warmer than before. Not because anything had changed dramatically, but because presence itself could alter a place. Lena was no longer at the kitchen table. She sat on the sofa now with the crocheted blanket around her shoulders, one arm resting protectively near the velvet box beside her. Her face was still pale, but some of the strain had eased, not gone. Simply softened by the fact that the doctor had come and the day had not collapsed under the weight of old ghosts. Annie took the drink tray from him carefully. "I remembered straws," she announced, as if she had personally negotiated the achievement. "I'm glad one of us was thinking clearly," Richard said. Lena watched the exchange with a guarded expression that kept trying and failing to become something else. "You really went to get all that?" He set the bags on the small kitchen counter. "I said I would." She gave a faint, tired sigh. "You always did sound sincere right before making my life more complicated." The remark should have stung. It did. But beneath it, he heard something else too, a rhythm that belonged to the past, to the old way she had spoken when she was trying not to smile. The recognition of it hurt more than the words. "I'll try to keep the complications edible," he said. Annie laughed softly at that and began unpacking the food with the seriousness of a child entrusted with grown-up work. She placed plastic forks, napkins, and containers on the table one by one, arranging everything with neat concentration. Richard moved automatically to help, but Lena stopped him with a look. "You don't know where anything goes." He glanced around the apartment. "That obvious?" "Yes." He almost smiled. "Then I'll follow orders." For a few minutes, they let the ordinary task of laying out dinner take over. The small table could barely hold the containers. Annie insisted on opening each one herself, peeling back the lids with determined fingers and inhaling approvingly at the smell. Fried chicken, mashed potatoes with gravy, green beans cooked Southern-style biscuits, and a slice of lemon pie wrapped in wax paper. Nothing fancy, nothing curated. Just warm food bought before sunset because a child had asked for it and a tired woman needed to eat. Annie climbed into her chair and looked at her mother. "See? Proper groceries. Lena gave her daughter a look that tried to be stern and did not quite succeed. Dinner from a diner is not groceries. It counts tonight, Annie said. Richard took the remaining chair and waited. He was suddenly aware of how intimate even this was, 3 people around a small table, sharing food, quiet settling around them not as distance but as something stranger and far more dangerous. Familiarity. Lena reached for her tea instead of the food. Eat something, Annie said, not unkindly, just with the plain insistence of a child who had already learned how to worry. Richard said nothing. This was not his place. Not yet. Lena looked at her daughter and then, after a moment, picked up a fork. You sound older than 6. Annie took a bite of mashed potatoes. You sound tired. The answer was so direct that Richard had to look down at his plate to hide the involuntary reaction that passed across his face. Lena noticed anyway. She gets that from you, she said. He looked up. The honesty? The impossible timing. For a brief moment their eyes held, and something unspoken moved between them. Memory, accusation, perhaps both. Annie, thankfully, or dangerously, was too busy with the biscuit to notice. After a few minutes, Richard realized Lena had eaten several bites without seeming to notice she was hungry. That alone felt like a quiet victory. Annie drank sweet tea through her straw with the concentration of someone performing an important ritual. This is good, she declared. Better than cafeteria food. You compare everything to cafeteria food, Lena said. Because cafeteria food is sad, Annie replied. It tastes like people gave up. Richard let out a soft breath that might have been a laugh. That may be the most accurate review of institutional cooking I've ever heard. Annie looked pleased with herself. I tell the truth. Yes, Richard said quietly. You do. The words came out heavier than he intended. Annie didn't seem to notice, but Lena did. She set her fork down. Annie, baby, why don't you take your pie to the sofa and put on that cartoon you like? The one with the dog. Annie narrowed her eyes slightly. Are you sending me away? No, Lena said. I'm giving you pie and television. That's called good parenting. Annie considered the logic, then accepted it. She took her plate and drink to the sofa, dragging the blanket over her legs before reaching for the old remote. Within seconds, bright voices filled the room from the television cartoon noise, cheerful and simple, creating the kind of cover adults often used when they needed a child occupied but nearby. Lena waited until Annie was fully absorbed before turning back to Richard. You shouldn't have asked about lemon pie. He leaned back slightly. I know. Then why did you? Because memory had outrun caution. Because he still remembered the exact expression she used to make when she tasted it. Because grief, once reopened, did not move politely. I forgot to be careful, he said. Lena gave a tired shake of her head. No. You remembered too fast. That was true too. He looked toward Annie for a moment. She was balancing the pie plate on her knees, utterly focused on the cartoon dog rescuing someone from something absurd. Then he lowered his voice. Did you ever tell her about me? Lena's answer came immediately. No. He accepted that without complaint. She asked about her father. Lena said after a moment. Of course she did. When she was 4, then 5, then 6 in a different tone each time. I told her the truth I thought would hurt her least. That some people leave because they are weak, not because the child wasn't worth staying for. The words struck him harder than open blame would have. And now? Lena's gaze held his. Now I don't know what the truth is going to cost. He let that sit between them. The television chirped in the background. Annie laughed at something on screen, and the sound was so normal that it almost broke him. There should have been years of that. Mornings, school pickups, scraped knees, bad report cards, Christmas mornings with wrapping paper on the floor. Not this strange, borrowed beginning at the edge of a life already formed. I meant what I said, he told Lena, about helping. She was quiet a moment. Helping is easy for men like you. It comes with signatures and transfers, and people who answer the phone. Living with what was done is harder. I know. No, she said softly. You know it happened. That's not the same thing. He could not argue with that either. At the sofa, Annie turned down the television volume without looking back. I can still hear you, she informed them. Lena closed her eyes briefly. Of course you can. Annie twisted around to face them. Are you fighting? No, Richard said. Yes, Lena said at the same time. Annie looked from one to the other, unimpressed. That's confusing. Richard glanced at Lena. Fair point. Lena rubbed one hand over her forehead, then looked at Annie. We're talking. That sounds like fighting in church clothes, Annie said. This time Richard did laugh. So did Lena, though hers came with a hand over her mouth as if she hadn't meant to let it out. The moment lasted only seconds, but Annie smiled as if she had accomplished something important. When the laughter faded, the room changed again. Not dramatically. No miracle. No easy peace. But some of the stiffness had gone out of it, some of the brittle edge replaced by something more human, and therefore more frightening. Annie set down her empty pie plate. Mr. Whitmore? Yes? She hesitated just long enough to show that whatever came next mattered. If you knew my mama before, does that mean you knew me before I was born? The question landed with astonishing gentleness and devastating precision. Lena went still. Richard felt the world narrow. Children had a way of walking straight through the front door of a truth adult circled for years. He did not answer immediately, because whatever he said now would move them all closer to the thing waiting just ahead. Finally, he said, I knew your mother when we were both much younger. Annie considered that. Did you love her? Lena drew in a breath. Richard looked at the little girl on the sofa, at the seriousness in her face, at the complete absence of performance in the question. There was no room for cowardice in that moment. No room for elegant evasions. Yes, he said. Annie glanced at her mother, then back at him. Do you still? The room became so still that even the television seemed suddenly too loud. Lena's hand tightened around her tea mug. Richard did not look away, and for the first time all day, he understood that dinner had not simply brought him back to Maple Street. It had carried him to the exact point where the past would either finally tell the truth or lose them all over again. Annie's question did not fade when it was asked. It stayed in the room, quiet and patient, the way truth often did when it knew there was nowhere left to hide. Do you still? Richard did not answer immediately, not because he did not know, but because he understood, finally, that the way he answered mattered more than the answer itself. Lena's hand tightened around her mug. Annie, no, Annie said softly, not defiant, just steady. I want to know. There was no impatience in her voice, no demand. Only the simple expectation that adults, once asked something important, would tell the truth. Richard looked at her, then at Lena. He had spent most of his life choosing the answer that preserved structure, family, reputation, order. That instinct was still there, sharp as ever, urging him to soften, redirect, postpone. But something in him had already shifted too far to go back. Yes, he said. The word was quiet, but it did not waver. Lena closed her eyes. Annie watched both of them carefully. Then why aren't you together? There it was again. The next question. The one that followed naturally once the first truth was allowed in. Richard leaned forward slightly, his elbows resting on his knees, his voice lower now. Because I made choices a long time ago that hurt your mother. And I didn't come back when I should have. That's it? Annie asked. No, Lena said, opening her eyes again. That's not all of it. Richard glanced at her. She was watching him, not with anger now, but with something far more difficult clarity. You can't answer her like this is a simple mistake, Lena continued. It wasn't. It was years. It was silence. It was a life built without you because there was no sign you were coming. Annie shifted on the sofa, pulling the blanket tighter around her legs. So, you left? Richard held her gaze. Yes. On purpose? The question cut sharper than the last. He took a breath. I believed something that wasn't true. I thought your mother had chosen to leave me. And instead of finding out the truth, I let it be the truth. Annie frowned slightly. That doesn't make sense. It didn't, he said. Not then, not now. Lena let out a quiet breath, somewhere between exhaustion and disbelief. You see, she said softly, this is why I never told her. Because there is no version of this that sounds right when you say it out loud. Annie looked from one to the other again. Did you know about me? The question arrived exactly where both adults had been trying not to go. Richard felt it land before he could prepare for it. No, he said. Annie studied his face carefully, as if searching for something hidden beneath the word. Not at all? No, he repeated. Lena's voice was quieter now. I didn't tell him. Annie turned toward her. Why not? Lena hesitated. For a moment, the strength she had held all day seemed to flicker, because by the time I knew you were coming, his life was already decided. And I wasn't going to bring you into a place where you had to fight just to be allowed to exist. Annie absorbed that slowly. So you chose for me. The words weren't accusatory. That made them heavier. Lena looked at her daughter, and something in her expression softened in a way it hadn't all day. Yes, she said. I did. Annie nodded once, as if placing that truth somewhere inside herself where she would return to it later. Then she looked back at Richard. Are you going to leave again? The question was so direct that it seemed to stop the air. Richard didn't move. This, he realized, was the real moment. Not the past, not the explanations. This, what came next. No, he said. Annie's eyes narrowed slightly. People say that. I know. And then they still leave. He nodded. Yes. Silence stretched between them. So how do I know you won't? She asked. Richard leaned back slowly, the weight of the question settling into him in a way nothing else had. There was no answer he could give that would satisfy her immediately, no promise strong enough to erase what she already understood about the world. You don't, he said. Lena glanced at him, surprised. Annie frowned. That's not a good answer. It's the only honest one, he replied. You don't know yet. You'll know later. By what I do, not what I say. Annie sat with that, then quietly, okay. It wasn't trust, but it wasn't rejection either. It was something in between, something fragile, something real. The television continued playing in the background, forgotten now. Outside, the light had begun to dim, shadows stretching longer across the small apartment floor. Lena shifted slightly on the sofa, wincing almost imperceptibly. Richard noticed. You should lie down, he said. I'm Fina. You're not. She gave him a tired look. I don't need you to tell me how I feel. No, he said quietly, but I can still see it. For a moment, it seemed like she might argue again. Then something in her expression changed. Not surrender, not agreement. Just a temporary truce with her own exhaustion. Help me up, she said. The words came out before she could stop them. Both she and Richard seemed to register that at the same time. He stood immediately, but slower than he might have once, careful not to turn the movement into something that felt like control. He offered his hand. She looked at it for a second, just long enough to acknowledge what it meant, then took it. Her hand was colder than he expected. He helped her stand, steadying her without pulling too close. Annie watched from the sofa, silent again, absorbing everything. I can walk, Lena said, though she didn't let go right away. I know, he replied. Together, they moved the short distance to the bedroom. The room was small, barely large enough for the bed, a dresser, and a narrow nightstand. The kind of space that held a life reduced to essentials. Richard stepped back as she sat down, then reached for the extra pillow without being asked. You remember where things go? She said softly. Some things, he answered. She lay back slowly, the strain showing now that she wasn't hiding it. Annie appeared in the doorway, still wrapped in the blanket, the velvet box tucked under one arm. Can I stay in here? She asked. Lena nodded. Of course. Annie climbed onto the bed carefully, settling beside her mother. Richard stood near the door, unsure of where he belonged in that moment. Mr. Whitmore? Annie said. He looked at her. You can stay too, if you want. The invitation was small, unceremonious, but it carried more weight than anything else she had said. He hesitated, then stepped into the room just enough to lean lightly against the wall. I'll stay, he said. Lena closed her eyes, not fully asleep, but no longer holding herself up against everything. Annie rested her head against her mother's shoulder, one hand still gripping the velvet box like a quiet promise. The room grew still, and in that stillness, Richard understood something with a clarity that left no room for retreat. This was not about fixing the past. It was about earning a place in what came next. No title, no certainty, no guarantee, just presence. And for the first time in a long time, he did not look for a way out. The apartment fell into a quiet that did not feel empty. It felt earned. Lena's breathing deepened first, slow and uneven at the start, then gradually settling into something steadier. Annie remained awake longer, though she didn't move much. her small fingers still resting on the velvet box, as if she had made a silent agreement not to let it go again. Richard stayed where he was, leaning lightly against the wall near the door, careful not to shift the fragile balance in the room. He had spent years in spaces far larger than this one room's designed to impress, to dominate, to remind everyone inside them exactly who held control. But none of those rooms had ever required what this one did now. Stillness, restraint, presence without intrusion. He watched as Annie's eyes finally began to close. She fought it for a while, blinking slowly, her gaze drifting between her mother's face and the man standing quietly nearby, as if she needed to confirm that both would still be there when she woke. Eventually, exhaustion won. Her head slipped slightly against Lena's shoulder, and her breathing softened to match her mother's. Only then did Richard move. He stepped closer, careful with each motion, and gently pulled the blanket higher over both of them. Annie stirred faintly but did not wake. Lena shifted just enough to settle more comfortably, her hand brushing lightly against Annie's arm as if even in sleep she knew exactly where her daughter was. Richard stood there for a moment longer than necessary. There was something disarming about seeing them like this, unprotected by conversation, by strength, by the guarded edges both of them had worn all day. Just a mother and a child, resting in a space that had been held together by will alone for far too long. He stepped back again, returning to the doorway, and then he stayed. Minutes passed, maybe more. Time moved differently in that room, measured not by clocks or obligations but by breath and quiet. His phone vibrated once in his pocket. He didn't check it immediately. When he finally did, the screen lit up with a name he expected. Grace. The call continued, insistent, as if repetition might force a response. Richard watched it ring, then he silenced it. A second later, another notification appeared. A message this time. He didn't open it. Instead, he slipped the phone back into his pocket and looked again at Lena and Annie. This, he realized, was the difference, not between past and present, but between noise and meaning. Eventually, the apartment shifted around him again. The distant hum of traffic outside, pipes moving somewhere in the building, a door closing in another unit, ordinary life continuing, unaware that inside this one room, something had begun to change direction. Richard stepped quietly out of the bedroom and pulled the door halfway closed, leaving it open just enough to hear if either of them stirred. The kitchen still held the remains of dinner. Half-empty containers, used napkins, a glass with melted ice. He stood there for a moment, looking at it all, unsure of what to do with something so simple. Then, slowly, he began to clean, not efficiently. Not like someone used to directing staff or expecting things to be handled, but carefully, almost deliberately, as if each small action mattered in a way he was only beginning to understand. He gathered the containers, rinsed them in the sink, wiped down the table. The movements were quiet, restrained, almost unfamiliar. There was no audience for this, no recognition waiting at the end of it, only the act itself. When he finished, the kitchen looked much the same as it had before dinner, small, worn, but orderly again. He leaned against the counter, exhaling slowly. For the first time since that morning, he allowed himself to think forward. Not backward, forward. The thought came with weight. Lena needed care. Real care. Not temporary help. Not a visit from a doctor that could be framed as generosity and then forgotten. Something sustained. Something reliable. Annie needed more than that. She needed stability, truth, time, and all of it pointed to a reality Richard had not yet spoken aloud, not even to himself in full. If he stayed, truly stayed, nothing about his life would remain the same. The estate, the company, the divorce that was already beginning to unfold, the expectations of people who had built their influence on his consistency. None of it would fit around this without breaking somewhere. The question was, where would he allow it to break? A soft sound from the bedroom pulled him back. He moved immediately, stepping quietly to the door and pushing it open just a little wider. Annie had shifted, her brow slightly furrowed even in sleep. Lena's arm tightened instinctively around her, pulling her closer without waking. Richard watched for a moment. Then he spoke, barely above a whisper. "It's all right." The words weren't meant to wake them, just to exist in the space. Annie's expression softened slightly, the tension leaving her face. Lena did not wake. Richard remained there until he was certain neither of them would. When he stepped back again, the decision he had been circling all evening finally settled into something solid. He reached for his phone. This time, he didn't hesitate. He dialed. Martin Keene answered on the second ring. "Richard? I want everything moved forward," Richard said quietly, his voice steady but low enough not to carry into the bedroom. "The divorce, the filings, all of it." There was a brief pause on the other end. "That can be arranged." "Are you certain?" "Yes." Another pause. Then, more carefully, "And the rest?" Richard looked toward the half-open bedroom door. "They're not staying here," he said. The words felt different once spoken. "Not as an idea, not as a possibility, as a decision. I'm bringing them to the estate," he continued, "but not as guests." Martin understood immediately. "That will raise questions." "It will. And the board?" "I'll handle the board." "And your family name?" Richard's gaze didn't move. "I've been protecting that name my entire life," he said. "It's time I decide what it actually stands for." Silence settled briefly on the line. Then Martin spoke again, quieter now. "Understood." Richard ended the call. He stood there for a moment, phone still in his hand, the weight of what he had just set in motion pressing fully into place. There would be consequences, public ones, private ones, irreversibles. He accepted that. For the first time in years, he accepted it without calculation. He moved back to the bedroom doorway one more time. Annie and Lena hadn't changed position. The room remained still, grounded in something that did not need explanation. Richard leaned lightly against the frame, no longer uncertain of where he belonged. Not fully inside, not outside, but no longer absent. And as the night settled over Maple Street, one quiet truth became impossible to ignore. This was no longer about returning what had been taken. It was about choosing, finally, what he was willing to give. Morning did not arrive gently. It came in pieces, first the faint gray light pressing through the thin curtains, then the distant noise of traffic beginning to gather outside, and finally the quiet, restless shift of a child waking before the world felt ready. Annie opened her eyes slowly. For a moment, she didn't move. Her head still rested against her mother's shoulder, the blanket wrapped around both of them, the velvet box tucked carefully beneath her arm like something she had held onto even in sleep. Then she remembered, not all at once, just enough. The gate, the house, the man. She lifted her head slightly and turned. Richard was still there. He hadn't taken the bed, hadn't left. He sat now in the chair near the window, his posture slightly forward, one hand resting against his temple as if sleep had come only in brief, reluctant intervals. His coat was folded neatly over the back of the chair, his sleeves rolled just enough to suggest he had not planned to stay but had chosen to anyway. Annie watched him quietly. He didn't notice at first. Then something shifted instinct, perhaps, and he looked up. Their eyes met. For a second, neither of them spoke. Then Annie said, "You stayed." Her voice was soft, but there was something inside it that hadn't been there the day before. Expectation. Richard straightened slightly, blinking once as he adjusted to the light. "I said I would." Annie nodded, as if marking that down somewhere important. Behind her, Lena stirred. The movement was small, but it changed the room instantly. Annie turned back, her hand already reaching for her mother's arm. "Mama?" Lena opened her eyes slowly, disoriented at first, then aware. Her gaze shifted from Annie to the room, then finally to Richard. She did not look surprised. She looked resigned, perhaps, but not in defeat. More like someone acknowledging that something she had hoped would remain temporary had instead stayed. "You're still here," she said quietly. Richard stood, not moving closer yet. "Yes." Lena pushed herself up slightly, wincing as she did. Annie immediately adjusted the pillow behind her back, without being asked. "You should lie back down," Annie said. "I'm all right." "You say that a lot." Lena gave her a faint look that held no real resistance. "And you argue with it every time, because it's not true every time." Richard watched the exchange in silence, something tightening quietly in his chest. This was what he had missed. Not just the milestones, the visible markers of a life, but the small negotiations, the habits of care, the way a child learned to read what adults tried to hide. Lena looked back at him. "What time is it?" "Just after 7. She nodded once. "You should go." The words were calm, expected, but Annie turned quickly. Why? Lena didn't look at her daughter when she answered. Because he has a life to get back to. Annie frowned. So? So people don't stay in places like this longer than they need to. The room went still. Richard stepped forward now, not aggressively, but with a steadiness that had not been there before. I'm not here because I need to be. Lena met his gaze. Then why are you here? He didn't hesitate. Because I chose to be. Annie looked between them again, sensing the shift even if she didn't fully understand it. Lena held his gaze a moment longer, then looked away first. That's not how choices work, Richard. Not the kind that matter. It is now. There was no edge in his voice, no attempt to overpower her argument. Just certainty. That, more than anything, unsettled her. She swung her legs slowly over the side of the bed, steadying herself before standing. Annie hovered close, ready to catch her if she faltered. I'm making breakfast, Lena said. You're not, Annie replied immediately. Lena gave her a look. You shouldn't, Annie corrected, adjusting her tone without backing down. Richard spoke before Lena could respond. I can handle breakfast. Lena almost smiled at that. But it didn't quite reach her eyes. You don't know where anything is. I'll figure it out. That's what worries me. Despite herself, Annie let out a small laugh. It broke the tension just enough. Richard moved toward the kitchen without waiting for permission this time. Not confidently, not like someone who belonged there, but not like a guest either. Like someone learning. He opened cabinets, checked the refrigerator, paused once or twice as he tried to understand what was available and what was missing. Eggs. Bread. Milk that might not last another day. A jar of peanut butter. Not much, but enough. Behind him, he could hear Lena lowering herself carefully into the chair at the table, Annie still close at her side. You don't have to let him do this, Lena said quietly. I didn't tell him to, Annie replied. That's not the same thing. Annie considered that. He didn't leave either. Lena didn't answer. At the stove, Richard worked more slowly than he ever had in a kitchen. Not because he didn't know how, but because every movement felt like it carried weight. This wasn't about making food. It was about proving something without saying it. He cracked the eggs carefully, toasted the bread, heated a pan longer than necessary just to be sure he wouldn't ruin what little they had. When he finally set the plates on the table, it wasn't impressive. But it was enough. Annie looked at it like it mattered. Looks good, she said. Lena looked at it like she didn't know what to do with it. Then, quietly, she picked up her fork. They ate in silence at first. Not uncomfortable. Just new. After a few minutes, Annie spoke again. Are we going back to your house? The question landed differently this time. Not as curiosity. As possibility, Lena set her fork down slowly. Annie, Richard answered first. Yes. Lena looked at him sharply. You don't get to decide that. No, he said calmly, but I can ask. That's not what you did. He met her gaze. Then I'll ask now. Silence stretched between them. Annie watched both of them, her eyes moving carefully, measuring. Why? Lena asked finally. Richard didn't look away. Because you need care, he said. Real care, and Annie needs more than this. Lena's voice sharpened slightly. This is her home, and it can still be, he said, but it doesn't have to be the only place she's allowed to feel safe. That struck something deeper. Lena's expression shifted, not into anger, but into something more complicated. Fear. People like you don't bring people like us into your world without a reason, she said. Richard nodded once. You're right. Then what's the reason? He didn't hesitate. Because I should have been there from the beginning. The words landed without defense, without excuse, just truth. Annie looked at him, then at her mother, and for the first time since this had all begun, she didn't ask another question. She just waited, because somewhere inside her, something had already begun to understand. This wasn't about where they were going. It was about whether this man was finally going to stay. The silence that followed Richard's words did not break quickly. It settled over the table, not heavy, but deliberate. As if each of them understood that what had just been said could not be undone or softened once it had taken shape. Because I should have been there from the beginning. Lena did not respond right away. Her fingers rested lightly against the edge of her plate. Her gaze lowered not in avoidance, but in thought. Annie watched her closely, as though the answer mattered less than how her mother arrived at it. Finally, Lena spoke. And now you think you can just step back into that place? Her voice was not raised. It didn't need to be. Richard didn't rush to answer. No, he said. I don't think I can step into anything that already exists. That made her look up. Then what do you think you're doing? She asked. Starting where I should have started, he replied. With honesty. And staying long enough for it to matter. Annie shifted slightly in her chair, her small hands folded together now instead of reaching for food. She was listening the way children did when they sensed something important was being built in front of them. Lena leaned back slowly, the effort still visible in her movements. You don't understand what you're asking for, she said. Then help me understand. A faint, tired breath escaped her. You're asking me to take my daughter into a world that already rejected us once. You're asking me to trust that it won't happen again just because you've decided things should be different now. Richard absorbed that without interruption. And you're asking me to believe that you won't disappear when it becomes inconvenient, she continued. Because that's what happens, not just with you. With people like you, there's always a point where it stops being simple. It's not simple now, he said quietly. No, Lena agreed. It's not. That was the first time they had stood on the same side of a truth without arguing it. Annie looked between them, then asked, What happens if we say no? The question redirected everything. Richard turned toward her. Then nothing changes unless you want it to. You'll still come back? She asked. Yes. Even if we stay here? Yes. There was no pause. No calculation. Annie studied him for a long moment. Why? The question was softer now. Not testing. Trying to understand. Richard leaned forward slightly, resting his hands against the table. Because staying isn't about where you live, he said. It's about whether I show up when it matters. Annie nodded slowly, as if placing that answer somewhere she would return to later. Lena watched her daughter carefully, then looked back at Richard. You're making this sound easier than it is. I'm not trying to make it easy, he said. I'm trying to make it real. That landed differently. For a moment, Lena said nothing. Then she reached for her glass, took a small sip of water, and set it back down with more care than necessary. You said the estate has medical care, she said. It does. And people who won't treat me like I don't belong there? Yes. She held his gaze. You're sure of that? Richard didn't hesitate. I am now. Something in the way he said it shifted the room again. Not because it erased doubt, but because it acknowledged it and still stood firm. Annie slid out of her chair and moved closer to her mother, resting one hand lightly against her arm. Mama, she said quietly, you were scared yesterday. Lena didn't respond immediately. You don't have to be scared there, Annie added. Not if he's there too. The simplicity of it cut through everything else. Lena closed her eyes briefly, the weight of exhaustion and decision settling together in a way that left no easy path forward. When she opened them again, she looked at Richard not with anger, not with forgiveness, but with something far more complicated. You don't get to do this halfway, she said. I won't. You don't get to show up for a week or a month and then decide it's too much. I won't. You don't get to confuse her, Lena continued, her voice tightening slightly. She's already had to grow up faster than she should have. I won't let her build something on you if you're not going to stay. Richard didn't move. Then don't let her, he said. Let me earn it. The answer surprised her. It wasn't resistance. It wasn't persuasion. It was acceptance. Of the conditions, of the cost. Annie looked at her mother again, quieter now. We don't have to stay forever. Lena's expression softened just slightly at that. No, she said. We don't. But we can try, Annie added. That word try hung in the air longer than anything else had, because it didn't demand certainty. It allowed space for failure. And for hope. Lena let out a slow breath, then leaned back in her chair, her strength clearly beginning to fade again under the weight of the morning. Richard saw it before she said anything. You're tired, he said. I'll manage. You don't have to. She looked at him, something almost like frustration flickering across her face. You keep saying that like it's something I've had the option to believe. He nodded once. Maybe it wasn't before. And now it is? Yes. The certainty in his voice didn't push. It held. That made it harder to dismiss. Lena closed her eyes again, just for a second, then opened them and looked at Annie. What do you want? She asked softly. Annie didn't answer immediately. She looked down at her hands. then at the velvet box sitting on the table, then back at her mother. "I want you to get better," she said. Lena's expression shifted. "And I don't want you to be alone when I'm at school," Annie continued. "And I don't want to keep worrying every time you get quiet." Her voice didn't break. That made it stronger. Then she looked at Richard. "And I want to see if he really comes back," she added. Silence followed. Not uncertain. Not tense. Just full. Lena looked at her daughter for a long time. Then slowly, she nodded. "All right," she said quietly. The word was small, but it changed everything. Annie's shoulders relaxed just a little, as if she had been holding something up that she could finally set down. Richard didn't speak right away. He understood that this moment didn't belong to him. It belonged to Lena, and to Annie. Finally, Lena looked at him again. "This is not your redemption story," she said. "Do you understand that?" "Yes. This is our life." "I know. And if you walk into it," she continued, "you don't get to control what happens next." Richard held her gaze. "I'm not here to control it," he said. "I'm here to be part of it if you let me." Another pause. Then Lena nodded once more, slower this time. "Then we'll come," she said. The decision didn't feel triumphant. It didn't feel certain. It felt real. Annie reached for the velvet box, holding it close again as if carrying something forward with her, not just a necklace, but the proof that something lost could be returned. Richard stepped back slightly, giving them space even as everything shifted around them. Because this wasn't the end of anything. It was the beginning of something far more difficult. And for the first time, all three of them were stepping into it together. They did not leave immediately. The decision had been made, but it did not carry urgency. It carried weight. Lena remained seated at the table for several minutes after she said yes, her hands resting quietly in her lap. Her gaze unfocused, as if she were measuring not the distance between Maple Street and the Whitmore estate, but the distance between the life she had built and the one she was now stepping toward. Annie, on the other hand, moved first, not with excitement, with purpose. She stood from the table, walked into the bedroom, and returned with a small, worn backpack. It was already half-packed, 2 changes of clothes, a book with a bent cover, a pencil case that had been taped more than once to keep it together. She set it on the chair. "We don't need much," she said. Lena looked at it, something tightening briefly in her expression. "We're not leaving everything behind." "I know," Annie replied. "Just for now." Richard watched from where he stood near the doorway, careful not to step too far into a moment that still belonged to them. There was something quietly revealing in the way Annie packed, not like a child going somewhere new, but like someone who had learned early what mattered enough to carry. Lena pushed herself up slowly, her strength uneven but steady enough. She walked into the bedroom without speaking, and for a moment the apartment fell into a different kind of quiet, the kind that comes when someone revisits a space knowing it will not feel the same when they return. Richard remained where he was. Annie glanced at him once, then said, "She's checking everything." He nodded. "I figured. She does that when she's nervous," Annie added. "I understand." Annie studied him for a second. "Do you?" He met her gaze. "Not exactly the way she does. But I know what it feels like to walk away from something without knowing if it'll still be there when you come back." Annie considered that, then nodded once, accepting it without questioning further. Inside the bedroom, drawers opened and closed, the faint rustle of clothing, a pause, then another movement, slower this time. When Lena returned, she carried a small box different from the velvet one Annie held. This one was older, its edges worn, the lid slightly warped from years of being opened and closed. She set it on the table carefully. "I'm not leaving this," she said. Richard didn't ask what it was. He didn't need to. Annie stepped closer, peering at it. "Is that the letters?" Lena nodded once. Annie didn't reach for them. She just looked. Richard understood then that whatever was inside that box belonged to a part of Lena's life that had survived even when everything else had been stripped down to necessity. "Take whatever you need," he said quietly. Lena glanced at him. "We're not moving in." "I know. This is temporary." "I know. And we decide when we leave." "Yes." Each statement was a line drawn, each answer, a promise not to cross it. That mattered more than anything else he could have offered. Annie picked up her backpack, then hesitated before grabbing the velvet box from the table. She held it for a second, then looked at her mother. "Should I wear it?" The question caught Lena off guard. "For now," Annie clarified. so it doesn't get lost again. Lena's expression softened, something fragile passing through it. All right, she said. Annie opened the box carefully, lifting the necklace with both hands the way someone might hold something that carried more than its weight. She turned slightly, and Lena reached out, fastening it gently around her neck. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Richard looked away, not out of discomfort, but respect. When he looked back, Annie had let the pendant settle against her chest, her fingers brushing over it once as if confirming it was real. Ready, she said. The word was simple, but it wasn't light. Lena took one last look around the apartment, not searching, remembering. The sofa, the small table, the chipped edges of the counter, the narrow hallway that had carried years of quiet survival. Nothing about it was grand, but everything about it was theirs. She turned back. Let's go, she said. The hallway outside felt narrower than before. Or maybe it was just that all three of them were aware now of what they were carrying, not in their hands, but in the space between them. Richard led the way down the stairs, though not far ahead. He kept his pace measured, matching Lena's without making it obvious, ready to steady her if needed but not assuming she would. Annie walked between them, not holding either hand, but close enough to both. When they stepped out onto the street, the day had already begun to move forward. Cars passing, people heading to work, ordinary life continuing, unaware of the quiet shift taking place in one small corner of it. Richard opened the car door for Lena first. She paused, just for a second. Then she got in. Annie climbed in after her, adjusting her backpack on her lap, her fingers brushing again against the necklace. Richard closed the door gently, then walked around to the driver's side. Before getting in, he looked once at the building, 214 Maple Street. He memorized it, not as a place he had rescued them from, but as the place where they had lived without him. That mattered. Then he got into the car. The drive began without music, without conversation, not because there was nothing to say, but because some transitions demanded quiet. After a few minutes, Annie spoke. Is your house very big? Richard glanced at her in the rearview mirror. Yes. Too big? He considered the question. It can feel that way. Annie nodded thoughtfully. Then maybe we should stay in the same part of it. Lena almost smiled at that. Richard did too. I think that's a good idea, he said. They drove the rest of the way like that conversation coming in small pieces, pauses in between. Each moment building something not yet named but slowly taking shape. When the gates of the estate came into view, Annie leaned forward slightly. That's it? Yes. It's big, she said. There was no awe in her voice, just observation. Richard slowed the car as the gates opened. Remember, Lena said quietly from the back seat, her voice steady again. We leave if it doesn't feel right. Annie nodded. We leave. Richard heard it, and he accepted it. Understood, he said. The car moved forward, and as they crossed the threshold, none of them knew exactly what waited on the other side, only that whatever it was, they would face it together. The car did not stop at the front entrance. Richard slowed as they passed the main steps. The wide stone staircase rising toward doors that had been built to impress anyone who approached them. The house stood exactly as it always had, imposing, precise, untouched by hesitation. But he kept driving. Lena noticed first. You missed it, she said quietly. I didn't, Richard replied. He guided the car along the curved driveway, past the formal entrance and toward the side of the estate, where the building opened into a quieter wing. The architecture softened there. Fewer columns, larger windows, a view of the gardens instead of the road. This way, he added. Annie leaned forward again, watching everything carefully. This is still your house? Yes. It feels different. It is. He pulled to a stop near a smaller entrance, one without the weight of ceremony, a door meant for living, not for being seen. Richard stepped out first and opened the rear door. Lena didn't move right away. She looked past him, taking in the space, not just the size of it, but the absence of distance. No long staircase to climb, no echo of empty rooms, just a doorway that led inward without demanding anything in return. This is where you stay? She asked. It is now, he said. That answer shifted something, not enough to erase caution, but enough to make the next step possible. Lena stepped out. Annie followed, her eyes moving quickly, taking in everything: the trimmed hedges, the wide windows, the quiet stillness of a place that had been maintained carefully, consistently, for years. "It's too clean," Annie said. Richard almost smiled. "That can be fixed." They entered together. Inside, the air felt different from the main house. Lighter, less formal. The floors were still polished wood. The walls still carried quiet art. But the space itself felt lived in, or at least capable of being lived in. A sitting room opened just beyond the entrance, with a long sofa, a fireplace, and windows that let in the late morning light. To the left, a hallway led to a series of rooms. To the right, a smaller dining area connected to a kitchen that, unlike the one on Maple Street, held more than just the essentials. Annie stepped in first, slowly. She didn't run. She didn't touch anything. She just stood there, turning once in place as if trying to understand how much space she had been given. "It's quiet," she said. "Yes," Richard answered. "Too quiet," she added. That, he understood. "It won't stay that way," he said. Behind them, Lena took a few steps in, her posture still guarded. She didn't look around with wonder. She looked with caution, as if expecting something to challenge her presence at any moment. No one did. Instead, Hargrove appeared quietly from the hallway. "Mr. Whitmore," he said, then paused as his gaze shifted to Lena and Annie. His expression didn't change, but something in his posture softened, subtle, respectful. "Miss Carter," he said gently. "Miss Annie." Lena gave a small nod, uncertain but not withdrawn. Annie looked at him for a second. "You're the one from the phone." Hargrove allowed the faintest hint of a smile. "I am. You sound taller in person," Annie said. That drew something like a breath of laughter from him, brief but genuine. "I'll take that as a compliment." Richard stepped slightly aside, letting the space unfold without directing it too forcefully. "The rooms are ready." Lena glanced at him. "Rooms?" "Yours," he said simply. "Not guest rooms. Not temporary arrangements. Just yours." She hesitated. Then, slowly, she followed Hargrove down the hallway. Richard and Annie stayed behind for a moment. Annie tilted her head slightly, still looking around. "Are there rules?" "Yes." She waited. "Most of them are about respect," he continued. "Not about where you can go." Annie nodded thoughtfully. "Good. Why?" "Because I don't like places where you're not allowed to touch anything," she said. Richard looked at her. "Then we'll make sure this isn't one of those places." Annie seemed to accept that. From down the hall, a door opened. Then another. Soft voices, Lena's, quieter than before, and Hargrove's, calm and measured. After a few minutes, Lena returned. Something in her expression had changed. Not completely, but enough. "They're nice," she said. Richard nodded. "They should be." Annie moved past him immediately. "Can I see?" "Yes," Lena said. Annie disappeared down the hallway. Richard remained where he was. For a moment, neither he nor Lena spoke. Then she said, "You didn't bring us through the front." "No." "Why?" He considered the question. "Because I didn't want the first step to feel like something you had to live up to," he said. "I wanted it to feel like somewhere you could stay." Lena held his gaze for a long moment. "That's new," she said. "It is." She let out a slow breath, her shoulders lowering just slightly. "I don't trust this yet." "I know. I don't trust that it won't change." "I know. And I don't trust that you won't." He didn't look away. "That's fair." Silence settled again, but it wasn't as sharp as before. "I'll stay," she said finally. "For now." "That's enough." She studied him for a moment, as if measuring the truth of that response. Then Annie's voice echoed from the hallway. "There's a window in my room." The excitement in it was small, but real. Lena turned instinctively toward the sound. Richard watched her. That was the moment. He realized not the arrival, not the decision, not the house itself. That, a child finding something to be glad about, in a place that had once been unreachable. Lena moved toward the hallway. Richard followed a few steps behind, not leading, not directing, just there. When they reached the room, Annie stood by the window, her backpack dropped carelessly on the floor. The velvet box placed carefully on the bedside table. Sunlight spilled across the space, catching the small pendant at her neck. "It's not too big," Annie said. "Just enough." Lena stood in the doorway, watching her, and for the first time since they had crossed the gate, she didn't look like she was preparing to leave. She looked like she was trying to imagine staying. Richard didn't say anything. He understood now that this part didn't belong to him. Not yet. Maybe not ever in the way he once would have expected. But as Annie turned from the window and Lena stepped fully into the room, it became clear that something had already begun to take root. Not trust, not forgiveness, but something quieter, something stronger, the willingness to remain long enough for both of those things to have a chance. The story reminds us that real redemption is not built on words, but on consistent actions over time. It teaches that love, once broken by silence and absence, cannot be repaired instantly. It must be earned through patience, honesty, and the willingness to stay when things are difficult. The quiet courage of a child and the strength of a mother show that trust is not given freely, but it can grow again when someone proves, day by day, that they will not walk away. In the end, the story speaks to a simple but powerful truth. It is never too late to do what is right, but it will always cost something real. This video is a work of fiction created with the assistance of artificial intelligence. All characters, events, and situations are not real and do not represent any actual people or true stories. The content is intended for storytelling and emotional illustration only.